I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker. We have Professor Julianne Nyhan, who is an emeritus professor or emerita professor of digital humanities here at UCL, one of my former colleagues. She's currently professor of humanities data science and methodology at TU Darmstadt in Germany. She's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society here in the UK, and her interdisciplinary research lies at the intersection of technology, history, memory, and heritage. She investigates not only how digital data, methods, and theories preserve the past, but also how they transform our understanding and remembrance of it, both positively and negatively. Her main research areas encompass digital humanities, digital oral history, which she's going to talk about tonight, digital history, and critical heritage studies. Her most recent book is Hidden and Devalued Feminized Labor in the Digital Humanities on the Index Themysticus project, which was published in 2023. She served for a number of years as the managing director of the Institute of History at TU Darmstadt, and before this, she had a number of roles here at UCL, including as the director of our wonderful Center for Digital Humanities. Tonight, she's going to be talking to us about oral history as data, critically approaching the digital term in methods, meaning, and recollection. And I'll hand over to you, Julianne. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you for this very nice introduction, Adam, and thank you for the invitation to give the Susan Hockey Lecture. So I remember when, I think it was Melissa Terrace inaugurated the Susan Hockey Lecture when I was a young lecturer, and I certainly never thought I'd have the honor of giving it, so thank you. So I'm just going to preface what I'm talking about by saying that I'm drawing on the work in this talk tonight and on thoughts that have come about in the context of work that we do in our digital oral history lab, which is shared between UCL and TU Darmstadt, and it's led by Andrew Flynn, Andreas Flichidis, and me. And we have at the moment two main research projects under the lab. So the first is called Midora, and I've just showed pictures and names of everybody who works on the project. I won't be able to mention everybody individually, but their work is amazing. We're so lucky to have the colleagues that we do. Also on the next project that I'll show you, which is multimodal digital oral history. So I'll say a little bit about these projects, and I just want to acknowledge now all the colleagues who are connected with them. Okay, so this paper examines the emerging horizon of both opportunity and challenge posed by the ongoing datafication of oral history. And I approach this horizon through the lens of artificial intelligence, though I hope my arguments are going to extend to broader algorithmic engagements. So in recent years, scholars from a number of disciplines have published position papers on AI in the humanities, AI and heritage. I've show you a selection of them here. So the question that I want to begin with is, why is oral history such an important place to think about this work? So oral history has recorded and preserved many human recollections of events, experiences, and attitudes of the 20th and 21st centuries. Recollections that might otherwise not have been recorded and made available for the historical record. But much is changing in how we can encounter and disseminate and analyze these histories. So Todd Pressner, in his recent brilliant book on the ethics of the algorithm, he points out that survivor testimonies of the Holocaust that were gathered by people like David Boder and the USC Shoah Foundation include interviews, or now mostly consist of interviews from people who have passed away. So their voices remain, but the individuals themselves in most cases no longer. And the way that we are increasingly accessing these resources is through AI, algorithmic processes, and computational tools. And so as Pressner puts it, and I quote, "It would not be an exaggeration to say that we are in the midst of a paradigm shift in which digital technologies will soon mediate and structure our access to a knowledge of all historical events, not just the Holocaust, and to the dead more generally." So this is a provocative observation. And while in response, Presner offers a really thoughtful ethics of what he calls digital distant witnessing, we also have to confront the wider dissonant motifs that are increasingly acknowledged of AI. So that is hallucination, misinformation, deepfakes, racialized and gendered undervaluing of labor in supposedly entirely automated systems, the centralizing and privatizing actions that have attended the commercialization of AI, often resulting in huge profits for a tiny handful of companies, the mass extraction of data, often without consent from the population at large, and of course the environmental toll of computation. So these concerns all complicate the ethics of digital mediation, and they raise urgent questions about the kinds of contextual and situated power structures that AI may produce or amplify within the field of oral history itself. But as concerning as that list that I just gave you is, I think the history of computing can be told as a story that has been shaped by many interests. The history of computing can be understood as a place of contestation. So through ongoing and often positive contestation, it's been shaped by the resistance work of women, the LGBTQ+ community, the global majority communities, and others who have contested, repurposed, and reimagined technologies and technological futures. So AI must not be just a closed system. The mere presence of contestation means that other futures, other possibilities exist. So I want to suggest to you, but by looking, as we will do tonight, at this intersection of AI and oral history, we're not simply engaging in a critique of tools and methods. We're asking wider questions about the future of memory, of recollection, of meaning-making in a datafied age. We're asking questions about how individuals and communities can, once again, productively contest technology to ensure that memory can actually endure in these datafied landscapes that we are all now in. So the main argument that I'm going to make tonight is that while generative AI, or AI, introduces really powerful and useful new tools to the field of oral history, its underlying logic, often favoring extraction, decontextualization, abstraction, prediction, really runs counter to so many of the foundational commitments of oral history to things like shared authority, situated knowledge, and so on. And so I want to propose tonight critical frameworks, data-led interventions, and historical perspectives, along with some implicitly collaborative practices that might engage and empower the oral history community to confront AI on the terms of oral history rather than the terms of AI, ensuring that the technology responds to humanities and heritage needs and not necessarily the other way around. So the structure then that I'm going to take is, I'm going to begin with some definitions and orientations. I'm going to then move on to reflect on what I identify as these epistemological and other misalignments between oral history and AI. And then I'm going to close with some possible ways forward of the many that do exist. So what is oral history? In her Reith lectures, Hilary Mantel described history as, and I quote, "what's left in the sieve when the centuries have run through it. A few stones, scraps of writing, and scraps of cloth." So what might oral history leave in the sieve? Fluttering glimpses, I guess, of ever-changing memory that are often not recorded on Mantel's scraps of stone and cloth. And I certainly had a sense of this when I interviewed in the work that I've done for the Hidden Histories project, which looks at histories of computing and the humanities. I certainly had a sense of this when I interviewed Michael Sperber-McQueen, who unfortunately passed away just a few months ago. So I'm going to play you a short excerpt from Michael's interview. Do you have regrets that you didn't get this so-called real job? Or that it...
Sometimes. Sometimes. My wife was appalled when she realized that as late as 10, 12 years after I got my degree, it still bothered me. She said, "You gotta let it go." And I said, if someone loses their leg, do you expect them to forget that they ever had a left foot? It doesn't bother me all the time, but I remember telling her at the time, this was probably the mid-90s, no, there's not a day that I don't think about it. An interesting thing happened in the early 90s, though. So it's no longer true that there's not a day that the thought crosses my mind that I would rather have had an academic job. Sometime in the early 90s, I taught a number of workshops in Tübingen together with Winfried Bader, who worked for Wilhelm Ott in the computer center there. And Winfried he studied theology, English doctorate, he was working at the computer center while looking for a real job or something. And when his time at the computer center ended, he had this sort of time-bounded position that one sometimes ends up with. He ended up going, there were no academic jobs to be had, he ended up going to the German Bible Society where he runs their electronic publishing program. I think still does. And we were chatting together with his successor in Ott's organization while we drank coffee, and she asked how it was going. And he said, oh, you know, for a long time I was in mourning for my academic career, but I'm getting over that. And somehow that, his way of formulating it, lange Zeit habe ich der Universität nachgetrauert. It managed to click something in my mind. And I recognized that the concept of mourning was a useful way to organize that part of my psychic experience. And having identified it as mourning, it became easier to deal with. So I have had greater acceptance.
Okay, so Mike, as many of you will know, Michael Spurberg McQueen was the editor of the XML spec. So he was the co-editor of what became essentially the lingua franca of data exchange of our times. So it really caught me off guard that he then reflected on his academic career with such regret in this interview. But I think this is one of the things that oral history can get us to the heart of. This helps us to understand the complexity and the emotional impact of scholarly hope and scholarly aspiration, sometimes failed aspiration, that is otherwise excluded from narratives of knowledge production and from archives, from authoritative archives. So oral history at its core then is a subjective recollection of the past expressed in the present and shaped by the relational exchange between the interviewee and interviewer. It's not merely a method of data collection, it's a co-created narrative deeply embedded in cultural, social and temporal contexts of its telling. It can function in recovery mode, but there's often just as much interest in, and I quote, the truth of the telling rather than the telling of the truth. So it's not necessarily not foreclosing recovery, but it's not necessarily positivist or empiricist. It's concerned with what is remembered, how and why it's recalled, shaped, or even silenced by the act of narration. So oral history is not only a method and a source, we might say for many scholars and practitioners, it is an intellectual, social and ethical commitment to writing histories that are inclusive, democratic, human-centered. And I've picked just a collection of international oral history landing pages to illustrate this point. So today, oral history is increasingly driven by a new phase. It's always been a technological discipline, but it's increasingly driven by datafication. So interviews are now routinely captured digitally. Retro-digitization projects, such as the British Library's Unlocking Our Sound Heritage, are vastly expanding the corpus of accessible audio and visual material. And so from an earlier oral history landscape, as comprising the interview, the recording of the interview, the transcript, and the interpretations, we see now that there's this whole ecosystem of digital tools, algorithms, and representations of oral history emerging. And certainly AI is playing, and generative AI is playing a huge part in this. So with tools like automated speech recognition, ASR, opening up incredible new opportunities to unlock huge swathes of oral history at scale, opening up all sorts of new and exciting opportunities, but potentially also challenging for the future analysis of digital oral history. So just as I've done for oral history in discussing what it is and giving you some examples of it, let me now repeat this for AI, including also some of the work that my colleagues and I are doing in the context of digital oral history. And then I want to draw these two definitions and orientations together to make some critical remarks. So, of course, there's very, very many different types of AI, from computer vision, expert systems, natural language processing. But in this section, I'm going to mostly focus on generative AI, because it seems to be that it's from here that many of the currently exciting applications for oral history are emerging. So I've just mentioned Whisper and automated speech recognition tools. Another, I think, increasingly common use of generative AI is to use, for example, ChatGPT and other large language models to summarize oral histories. But if we return, we must do this with care, of course, as many of us have encountered. So if I return to Michael Spurberg-McQueen's interview that I just played for you, when I asked ChatGPT for the summary of it, it misrepresented what he had to say. Not crucially, but certainly it reduced a positive framing that was actually there in his further reflections. So, and we're going to look at more examples of this theoretically and also practically. So let me take a couple of minutes to describe at a high level, and as clearly as I can, because I'm not a computer scientist, how I understand generative AI to work. And then I'm going to revisit this a little bit later in my talk. So LLMs such as ChatGPT, they are essentially advanced statistical word prediction systems that generate text by predicting the most likely next token, word or part of a word, based on the preceding or surrounding context. So the steps generally undertaken include data collection, data curation, training of the model on the data, model adaptation, and then downstream deployment. So with data collection, we see vast amounts of unlabeled textual data, often having been scraped from the internet, data typically created by humans, and that reflects a particular time, place, space and culture. And we know often subject to, or sometimes subject to, ownership and copyright. And it's really the scale of data collection that is crucial to understanding the subsequent and to achieving the subsequent generalization capacities of these models. In data curation, the raw data is then cleaned and curated into training data sets, often with considerable human intervention. Then we come to model training. And so this is when the data is used to train a large neural network, usually based on a transformer architecture. So the model learns patterns by converting words into mathematical representations and then processing them through multiple layers of the network. Through training, those statistical relationships are learned between tokens, and so they can be the prediction of the next words with a high level of accuracy. Phenomena occur here such as emergence, where capabilities arise from the model despite not being explicitly programmed. And I just mentioned these to really enforce to you that the overview that I'm giving you is, of course, simplified, and it's even more so reflecting steps that we don't necessarily fully understand. Model adaptation follows. So this can then involve further training on specialized data sets or with techniques like reinforcement learning, so as to create a version of the model that can be adapted for a specific task. And then we have deployment into different contexts. So I'm not aware of a huge amount of work going on around this in oral history, but we can imagine that the adaptation and deployment might be training to do some sort of specialist summaries on an oral history collection, and then the deployment of that trained model. I'm not going to say, so this is from Whisper's GitHub explanation. I'm not going to go into a whole other explanation of this, just to say that it works in a way that is somewhat similar to the models like the LLMs that I've just described, in that it also uses a transformer-based neural network, but we're talking about pairing audio and text rather than text and text. So from this Whisper outflow, you then get your automated speech recognition. So I've just provided you with a very simplified, but a technical overview of how generative AI works. And in the next section of my talk, as I said, I want to draw this description into conversation with that of oral history. But first, I want to just ground this discussion of the technicalities of AI a little bit. And to do that, I want to give you some concrete examples of how the work that we're doing in our oral history lab is using AI of how we're trying to use AI to ask questions about oral history. So, and there's been a number of, so the Oral History Society has just, for example, published this really excellent kind of report and reflection on how AI is changing oral history research. And they emphasize, as I try to do here, the benefits as well as the difficulties. And so that's what I want to try to bring out a little bit in the discussion, the brief discussion that I'm going to give now of two projects where we're trying to fit AI to oral history. So the first that I want to mention is one called Multimodal Digital Oral History, and we published more of a, let's say, conceptual discussion of this work together with Hannah Smith in Digital Scholarship and the Humanities some time ago. And it's an exciting time in our work because we're now able to use AI to try to actually realize some of the ideas that we had at the time of this paper. So what we're trying to do is develop a methodology and a technical workflow for active engagement with the oral, and sonic artifacts of oral history. We've grounded this by wanting to look at instances of laughter in particular. So basically what we and what our colleague Eleske Varfolomeev has done is to develop an an ASR workflow which automatically outputs transcripts, but then detects instances of laughter in the transcripts. They're currently being categorized here, as you can see, into chuckle and chortle and belly laughter. I think this will be taken out in the next iterations. But you can see the blue is where the laughter is occurring, and then we can move from these segmented areas to access the laughter in the oral history file. This is very interesting for us because it allows us to actually search oral history at the effective level of the file, going beyond a keyword search. And we're bringing this aim to understand how laughter is working together with conceptual ideas in the humanities around ideas called so-called scholarly persona. So this is ideas about the different kinds of skills and epistemic commitments that shepherd knowledge production into view. So this has been very interesting work, and I think it really has opened up an approach to, still emerging, but it's opened up an approach to engaging with oral history, as I say, far beyond a keyword search that we wouldn't have had anyway. And our next task from all of this, quite some time has been spent doing ground truth data for this, but the next task is to then bring this work together with, for example, text analysis to understand more about the context around how laughter is being expressed, and then to think about this within our overarching aim, which is to think about knowledge production and the expression, discussions of knowledge production and epistemic vices and virtues. The second project that I want to mention to you is our MEDORA project. So this project seeks to use AI and semantic web technologies and historical interpretive analysis to better understand narratives of formation, disruption, and change in the history of computing in the humanities. Specifically, we're investigating how a bundle of these methods might help us to understand processes of formation, disruption, and transformation that have taken place across the wider digital humanities. One strand of this work, again, is trying to think about ways into analysing history that are not necessarily keyword-based. So what we're doing is extracting information about meaningful events and relationships between entities of interest, so triples. And we expect that they're going to offer us a very interesting way to examine ideas of agency and expressions of agency in oral history. Currently, our team member Jaje is evaluating a range of zero-shot AI models hosted on the Hugging Face platform. And it's just so interesting to observe to some extent that while I guess how difficult it is to work with these models and with oral history material. So the models perform reasonably well when identifying explicit factual relationships that align with formal descriptive language commonly found in the Wikipedia-based training sets that we know them to have been trained on. But actually, when it comes to our oral history interviews, which contain informal, conversational, and linguistically diverse speech, the models do all sorts of things like overgeneralize, make errors. There's certainly some bias involved. So we have to keep a watching brief on this. We have to keep doing manual review, and we have to see where the results lead us. But certainly, considering this AI oral history interface, it's fascinating to see on one hand, the power of this technology, then meet the inherent complexity of our humanities sources. Okay, so as we've seen in my technical discussion of some of the situated aspects of the AI tools that we're grappling with in our work, and as I indicated to you in this overview, I've just given you of the hands-on work we're doing with AI. Generative AI relies on the extraction and often the radical decontextualization of complex, situated information, turning so-called oral history interviews into data. This data is then curated into massive data sets, which are known to be frequently underrepresentative of undervoiced communities, poorly documented, or restricted by proprietary constraints. The data sets are used to train large general purpose models with the goal of achieving high accuracy in prediction tasks. Once trained, as we saw, they can then be deployed to other domains. And this can lead to a homogenization in which biases and limitations of the original foundation model are not only preserved, but amplified and transferred downstream. In addition to these epistemological and methodological factors of AI, we also have to attend to the material, the infrastructural, and the economic conditions that is required to do this research. So with generative AI, massive computational resources are required. High-end GPUs operating in parallel, energy-intensive data centers, sophisticated cooling systems, and vast models with billions of parameters. So for example, the cost of training GPT-4 has been estimated to be at over 100 million. And the fact of this situation is that most academic researchers in universities only can't contribute to fundamental AI research. So Bomancy et al. Have argued that for most of the history of computing, there's been a one-way march towards greater capability for lower cost and higher efficiency. The success of AI has inverted this curve. So AI, to summarize, is driven by a logic that is fundamentally different from oral history. It's being developed in institutions and research environments where oral historians are rarely present and seldom able to fundamentally contribute to. And AI can be understood as a multi-stage process involving, as we said, extraction, decontextualization, abstraction, generalization, prediction. And this stands in stark contrast to many of the characteristics of oral history that we have discussed. So where AI is data-driven, oral history is context-driven. Where AI is disembodied, it's a little bit simplified, but we'll say that, oral history is relational. Where AI can replicate homogeneity, oral history seeks diversity. So against this horizon, the complexity of oral history's take-up of generative AI is brought into view, allowing us to further reflect on the overarching mission of generative AI and how it manifests in localized communities. But as chilling as what I've just presented to you is, it's not all. There is much hope. There's many reasons to be optimistic, I think. So if we view AI as yet another chapter in the long history of computing that is a site of struggle between hegemonic and non-hegemonic interests, then, as I say, there are reasons to be excited. So in recent years, several coalitions, initiatives, even legislation have emerged. I won't go so I've put some images here, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And they are contesting and complicating the corporate, exclusionary, and proprietary landscape that I have been describing to you. Of course, none of these movements or even legislation is without criticism. And I guess the enormous financial costs of doing fundamental research in the area are not going to change. But as Underwood has observed, we can at least begin to see how scholars might train models that represent a wider range of perspectives. And I would go further. The existence of these alternative institutions, legislative interventions, and open source communities remind us that there's still choices to be made. There's still possibilities for asking when, how, why, for whom, and maybe sometimes even whether oral history should work with AI. So I want to move now to suggest to you three possible routes for how we might do this. I want to talk about critical analysis, data-led interventions, and then some wider reflections on what it is that is at stake. And what I'm not trying to do is to set out suggestions of fixed responses or technical solutions. What I'm trying to do instead is to reflect on ways of acting and collaborating and critiquing and researching that might help us to summon new futures in ongoing and collaborative fashion. And ChatGPT was kind enough to make these images for me. I'm not entirely sure how great they are, but they're better than what I was able to do. So I said, thank you, ChatGPT. Okay, so the first one is epistemologically based critical analysis. So at a recent talk that I attended, the presenter advised oral historians planning to use Whisper for automatic transcription to delete silences and gaps from their recording before processing. So this was, of course, a well-intentioned step, but even if it seems like a minor thing to niggle at, I think it's actually indicative of wider concerns, because it points to how oral history practice is being asked to change to technological efficiencies, actually in a way that goes against oral history, because as we've seen, oral history is interested in how memory is recalled. So of course, gaps and silences might be and have been in the literature of much interest. So my argument is that if we take an what I call an epistemologically based critical analysis, that we can notice these instances where the fundamental tenets of oral history is being questioned. And so I offer, and I'm going to do this now through the example of shared authority, and so I offer this as an indicative case study of how we might go about this, and one that can be applied to other core tenets of oral history, including diversity, subjectivity, and so on. So developments in AI are introducing a new level of automated intervention into some of the core tasks of oral history, as we've seen, such as the transcription of interviews. And these tasks are closely tied to a commitment in oral history to what is known as shared authority. When Frisch coined this term in 1990, it was to communicate how oral history is co-created through the conversation and ideally the equality of the encounter between the interviewer and the interviewee alike, thus creating a shared authority over the interview and the meaning that's made in the interview. And in time, this took on a wider sort of resonance to extend also to even downstream uses of and products and outputs and creative interventions of oral history. So oral history prompts consideration of who should be recognized for their contribution, at what stage of the oral history project. And it's also an ethical point that calls for the recognition of the sovereignty of the interviewee's voice, agency and perspective, and the nature of the self who creates and owns oral history. So if shared authority then stems from this recognition of an act of co-creation leading to ownership, what authority or ownership should be attributed to the AI model and its digital workflow in the machine-generated creation of interview transcripts? Who and what owns the transcripts, interpretations, and outputs produced by ASRs? Taking the example of Whisper, I'm not totally sure that this question is as easy to answer as I might have initially thought. So Whisper is released under the MIT license, which is a very flexible open source license. Even when publishing results obtained using Whisper, there's no need to technically cite that you've used it. The license explicitly states that there's no warranty of any kind for its use and no liability is accepted for any harm that may follow its use. And so what I found is that documents accompanying Whisper's release, such as the GitHub repository model card and related papers, are clear to reject responsibility for harm caused by it, but the issue of who might own things such as hallucination that you see here on the screen, that still remains somewhat unclear. And in the search that I did of the wider AI history, discussion of something like ownership, maybe for good reasons that I won't go into, but these discussions do not seem to come up so much that I or my colleagues have been able to find. And it's also clear from the computer science literature, so in this case of hallucinations, which is kind of an egregious, almost, one would hope, but not necessarily, example of these issues, it seems from the computer science literature, these are really difficult technical problems to solve. Solutions are not going to be in place anytime soon. And then compounding the problem is that we don't seem to have, that I can find, again, tools to automatically detect hallucinations in AI transcripts. Looking to the oral history literature, I've been able to find, in addition to our work where we encountered some hallucination but not huge amounts, what I've mostly been able to find is project-based discussions of when hallucination occurred. So this is from a presentation that was given in TU Darmstadt last year, looking at, so everywhere you see red, this is hallucinations in these Holocaust testimonials. When I look for benchmarking papers, which would seem to be really important for oral history collections, for the type of material that we deal with, there seem to be, I couldn't find benchmarking papers on hallucination and oral history, or ASRs and oral history. So it's not only the case that we, so what we see here is texts that were never spoken in the original interviews. But also when Kaneke and colleagues did a study of whisper translations on spoken text collections of people with something called aphasia, I think that word is right. They found that roughly 1% of audio transcriptions contained entire hallucinated phrases or sentences which did not exist in any form. They thematically analysed the hallucinations, and they found that 38% of them included explicit harms, such as perpetuating violence, making up inaccurate associations, or implying false authority. So obviously, if oral history is to be used in legal or truth and justice reporting settings, this could be very problematic. But also returning to that aim of oral history to represent the testimonies of marginalised and undervoiced peoples, this kind of distortion, potential distortion, seems very problematic. So I'm just watching my time. So, and other examples occurred that I might, I guess, just briefly, of issues that can occur that I'll briefly mention to you. So what happens to the self that is then summoned in this AI-generated transcript? So when generative AI transcribes, is the notion of a stably or intentionally constructed self becoming much more complex? Not only in instances of hallucination, but in ways that meaning may be subtly reshaped through word choice, phrasing, emphasis, particularly if interviewees don't have the opportunity to respond to those transcripts, or if researchers are working with oral history collections at scale and maybe don't have the possibilities to compare the original recording to the transcript. If AI-generated transcription, summarization, or interpretation becomes the default, will the narrator's ability to shape their own story erode? And of course, the life of the oral history interview doesn't end with the transcript, and shared authority in oral history has then extended beyond the interview itself. What happens in situations where interviews are being used in downstream AI applications, and this recent move towards agents that we've been hearing about, which is AI with some level of decision-making and autonomous action? What responsibilities might be employed for all parties involved, and could this use of AI within oral history represent a sharing of authority by stealth and a sharing of authority without consent? Given the possibility of currently understanding where we are with all of this, might it be the case that shared authority can't withstand, or could it be the case that it is decided that shared authority might need to be rejected in some computational contexts? So from what I've said, a range of desirable next steps and an outline of what an ASR pipeline and associated tools built especially for the oral history field would look like start to come into view. And I should say that in our laughter detection tool that I showed you earlier, we're taking much of this into account, and we hope that we'll be able to release this more widely. So things that come into view include the benchmarking of the features of oral history collections that trigger collections and how we're seeing this in practice, tools and interventions for detecting hallucinations, particularly in a data-driven phase where people are working at scale. Acknowledgement of the use of ASRs such as Whisper in oral history project documentation, including clear details about the model used. And while contemporary oral history practice often includes legal and ethical protocols to establish shared authority in interviews and digital archives, the use of AI models to generate transcripts from legacy recordings where no such consent exists must be further addressed. But the wider point that I'm making here is that this kind of epistemologically sourced algorithmic criticism that I'm calling for speaks to the bigger picture of what about oral history itself is amplified, contested, maintained. Okay, so I move on. I have 2 points left. I'm going to shorten the third, and we'll look in a little bit more detail now at data-led interventions before I move to wrap up. So I now want to draw attention to the risk that oral history seems to face in being marginalized or misrepresented within generative AI systems, but how this may possibly be seen also as a positive space for action. So data sits, as we've seen, at the very center of machine learning, and AI reveals, in the words of Crawford, which patterns of life are being assumed and reproduced by AI. So the data that's used helps us to think about the patterns of life that are being assumed and reproduced by AI. In recent years, a huge amount of attention has been drawn to the biases and the skews that are thought to characterize training data sets. So I won't repeat them here, but it is still thought that training data pertaining to, for example, social movement archives is poorly represented in training data. And so this raises the chilling possibility that the very communities and perspectives that oral history aims to document, amplify, and empower may be rendered invisible or distorted within AI systems that are now increasingly mediating so much of our public knowledge. Again, within the oral history context, there's not so much literature on this. One account that I found from Perkis is her discussion of using ChatGPT for, she prompted ChatGPT for an oral history about Hurricane Sandy, which resulted in a narrative that was neither descriptive nor historically accurate, that contained quotes from the song known as Earth, Wind and Fire. And when asked to provide its sources, similarly provided a list of maybe not so colourful interventions as Earth, Wind and Fire, but equally nonsense. So it seems to me that, as I say, I suppose this is an important area of attentional, social justice-oriented data intervention. Martin has argued that smaller models with intentionally curated data sets or trained or fine-tuned for precise tasks bring us closer to a goal that we all share of more informed, more accurate, and more precise knowledge. So would one possible way forward involve the oral history community itself intentionally curating high-quality, ethically sourced oral history data sets, reflecting a diversity of views and perspectives that can be then used in training, fine-tuning, or post-hoc adaptation. And within this area, there is some fascinating work going on. So the work of Stephanie Dinkins, for example, who trained an AI sculptural model on 3 generations of her family's testimonies, in part because she was too concerned about the nature of the data sets that were available to her and the kinds of, I quote directly, deep bias against blackness violences, really. So she did this amazing work, trained in oral histories with her family. The model quite often breaks down, but in this way we're taken back to this very interesting pivot point between social realities and the intervention of AI. So my point here is that in relation to the models, in relation to all the difficulties that we've seen with training data, there's been a number of developments in recent years, from data sheets for data sets, data narratives, and more recently the data essay, which are instruments that seek to provide machine-readable documentation of the characteristics of a training set. For example, its provenance, internal biases, ethical and usage considerations. And it seems to me that the oral history field, because of the close, because of how archiving is a part of this, the oral history field already has, together with archivists, huge expertise and professional standards in this. And so surely an important area of research for the next years is to think about so-called data sheets for oral history collections, considering how such instruments may be adapted to the particular characteristics of oral history collections, but also bridged to the long history the field has of documenting its collections. And such an effort would only align oral history with current conversations around AI ethics and transparency. It would not only do that, it would also help to protect the integrity and the sovereignty of its sources as they increasingly, and it seems unpreventably, enter machine-readable ecosystems. For whatever real-world impact the attaching of things like machine-readable data sheets to specially trained and curated oral history collections, whatever real-world difference they might make, surely it's important that the oral history world asserts the values and rights of a field rooted in dialogue, co-creation, consent, and contextual meaning-making in machine-readable ways. And now my very last section that I'm going to shorten quite considerably is about computational surveillance. So it's about the genealogies, it's about the sort of ideological context of not only AI, but I guess all computing to some extent. So oral history has a political commitment to center the voices and to recognize the importance of otherwise overlooked individuals and communities, such as working class women, working class people, indigenous people, and so on. And so it's a dreadful irony that AI, like as I said, computational systems more widely, can be deeply implicated in regimes of surveillance and power, sometimes aimed at those particular communities that oral history seeks to work with. So as Ian Hacking has put it, the abstractions that we've talked about, so the abstractions that I've been talking about, Ian Hacking has said in relation to them that they afford the coercive claim that AI is a universal knowledge machine rather than a statistical enactment of the ideology that one can improve control, a deviant subpopulation by enumeration and classification. So the outcomes of this, of course, can be complex. An immediate harm is made perfectly clear on the Whisper AI model card, and that is that the technology can be used to identify individuals. And so much care is needed with the use of ASRs with, for example, activist and political oral histories. I might also mention that in a recent article that my colleagues and I published looking at the wider documenting of resistance, conflict, and violence, we asked a number of questions that can be adapted, I think, fruitfully to the oral history domain. They include, how can we balance the ethical imperative to preserve and share voices with the potential for serious harm that may arise from the inclusion of such voices in algorithmic processes and workflows? The question of what informed consent can even mean where participants cannot be made fully aware of how their interviews can be used by, for example, AI agents. What safeguards might be put in place to prevent the misuse of oral histories? In other words, what might a do no harm approach look like in the age of oral history AI? And I want to close by just pulling back to one very final reflection about how we can create circumstances for change and empowerment. And to do this, it seems to me to be really important that we historicize the development and the take-up of AI and other computational processes in humanities, heritage, and oral history and memory domains. And to keep at the forefront of our minds that the shape of the present is not necessarily the most logical outcome of the past. And we can take inspiration from so many collective action, communities and movements to do this. So communities who have resisted or challenged or modified, it doesn't always have to be, I think, so confrontational, power exerted by actors such as state, technology, or even the mainstream archival institutions. And so this is why I've put, as an example, the amazing work of the Community Archives and Heritage Group, who seem to productively occupy such an independent and empowering space. Conclusions. So, in this talk, I have addressed the epistemological tenets of oral history, especially its emphasis on shared authority and the social, political, and ethical attention that oral history as movement gives to the capture and preservation of diverse, democratic, human-centered, empowering, and even restorative histories. I've reflected on how these tenets may be positioned, repositioned, obfuscated by AI, with particular attention to how AI structures knowledge production. My contention is that, though in many cases AI undoubtedly has much to offer oral history, with, for example, as I said, whisper making vast collections accessible to humans and machines in new ways, it's also the case that AI's logic, underlying logic, favouring extraction, abstraction, prediction, and efficiency, can run counter to oral history foundational commitments, and we must draw this into view and respond to it. So against this backdrop, it becomes critical to evaluate how and whether to adopt AI and when to adopt AI in oral history discipline-specific ways. And I've argued through my discussion of what I've called an epistemologically grounded algorithmic critique that this is so I've suggested that this is one way into it. And I've likewise argued through points on regimes of surveillance, extraction, and datafication that it's likewise necessary for oral historians to ask from a longue durée perspective who benefits from these tools, who will benefit from these tools, who is left out, who is included without their consent, and for what ends. And through my acknowledgement of forms of resistance and independence that have been enacted and mobilized by collective communities in the face of technological, archival, and state power, I've attempted to draw attention to the modes of being, acting, knowing, researching, and collaborating that can cultivate a sense of agency in the face of AI in some contexts. So all of this matters, I think, because it raises questions about how and whether historians can preserve space for co-creation, for agency, for memory, and interpretation in a time of automated knowledge mobilization, production, and analysis. And so it's crucial for oral history to engage with AI in this way and to attend to these issues. Andrew Flynn often reminds us in his talks that it's possible to go back to the archive to find that other futures are possible. This must be true of the computationally mediated archive too. And so if the current proposition may seem to go in a direction that requires the human and the archive of memory to fit to a technology, then our task is to push against this, to create new futures for the AI oral history encounter that hopefully can benefit both sides. So in this talk, I've given a necessarily incomplete, but nevertheless a first offering of some of my thoughts of the work that we can do around this so that other futures are indeed possible. Thank you for your attention.